there's an agonistic struggle that is able to be played out, but it's kind of bounded in a certain way, and it doesn't get to the level of maybe wanting to kill or actually being constituted politically in such a way as you're ready to kill.
It's the sissy version of it. It's
existential conflict. It's like soy Schmitt. It's like soy Schmitt.
Soy Schmitt.
Left of Philosophy. I'm Owen, and here with me today is Lillian.
Hi.
Will.
Hey.
And Gil.
Hello.
Slew, Will, and Gil. So
did you just notice that?
Yeah, apparently. I'm the outlier. So a bit of a different vibe on today's episode. We don't discuss reactionaries very often, but we thought we'd change it up a bit and discuss Carl Schmitt, focusing especially on his 1923 book, The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. This book belongs to the period of Schmitt's work for which he is perhaps best known, and which has attracted the most attention among political theorists, the period spanning from the 1920s and early 1930s, before he officially joined the Nazi Party in 1933, the same year Heidegger joined. During the Third Reich, Schmitt was a prominent Nazi jurist and was even appointed as the president of the Association of National Socialist German Jurists. Because of his unrepentant Nazism and refusal to undergo denazification after the war, he was banned from teaching, although he did go on to author several books that have garnered significant academic attention in recent years, especially Nomos of the Earth and Theory of the Partisan. For the last several decades, there has been something of a Schmitt renaissance, with his work being taken up by contemporary conservatives and reactionaries across the globe, who find in his work a distinctly right-wing attack on liberalism, and who affirm his view of politics as an irreducible struggle between friend and enemy. Interestingly, though, Schmitt has, since the 1990s, also become a central point of reference across a broad terrain of theory from the left, including extensive appropriations of his work by Giorgio Agamben and Chantal Mouffe, though the left has had a much more fraught relationship with this thought. Some seek to separate what they consider to be salient and illuminating concepts from the more or less fascist tendencies in his thinking. Concepts like the state of exception and sovereign suspension of law, those became particularly fashionable points of reference during the Bush years. The irreducibility of the friend-enemy antagonism in all politics, or in his anti-liberal conception of democracy. Others decry the dangerous mystique that draws thinkers to his work, claiming that there are no philosophical or political lessons in Schmitt that we are not much better served by learning elsewhere, in Machiavelli or Lenin or Hegel. So before we discuss, just a quick word then about the Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. The central aim of the Crisis book is to define with rigorous precision the organizing principles of what he calls parliamentarism. This requires, he argues, dispelling the notion that parliamentary representation and democracy are equivalent, or even organically connected. Democracy for Schmitt just means the identity of ruler and ruled, of political power with the will of the people. And there's nothing a priori that excludes dictatorship, for example, from embodying this identity, and therefore from being democratic. Democracy and dictatorship are paradoxically perfectly compatible for Schmitt. Moreover, whereas the parliamentary system of electing representatives purports to be the only practicable form of democratic politics, Schmitt is keen to point out that elected representatives in actual bourgeois liberal democracies are much more beholden to the interests of capital or to the interests of party or to their own egotistic interests than they are to the ephemeral will of the people that is said to be expressed in the aggregate votes cast in a private booth. So that seems like a good place to start today. And this attempt that he makes to disarticulate liberal parliamentarism from democracy. Something, by the way, that those in the Marxist tradition are often keen to do as well, right? To disarticulate liberal parliamentarism from democracy. So I guess I want to start by asking what you all make of this attempted disarticulation. And do you find his critique of liberalism and liberal representation compelling? Because I think that's the starting point. This is what always happens with Schmitt, right? You start reading a few lines and you're like, okay, that's facts. And then he tries to seduce you into a set of entailments that maybe you weren't ready to accept. You know, like
don't you want
dictatorship.
A little bit dictatorship?
Exactly, just a little bit of dictatorship. And it's all good. It's all democratic, fam.
Yeah. So I'll just jump in and I'll say, on top of the chapters you guys read, I also read the preface to the second edition, and that's where he also makes this the 1926, where he makes a distinction between liberalism, which seems to have this principle of everyone is equal, and democracy for him, which is equal according to the sphere that you are in, and equal for equals, but they always entail some version of inequality. And so while reading this, I'll start off with something I found kind of compelling what he's trying to say there, which is he's trying to say that liberalism gets hung up because it basically tries to stretch the principle of equality to a point where it becomes vacuous and empty. And once it's vacuous and empty, something I noticed with Schmitt, he's saying it no longer has the intensity, the political capacity to actually effectuate whatever it is it's trying to do. And so something that I thought was interesting what he was saying there is that, he's saying that, no, there are distinct spheres of social life, and politics is a distinct sphere, and to try to liquidate them and make them all the same, he thinks that's what liberalism is trying to do, rather than democracy adheres to the specific quality of the political space that entails not just universal equality, but equality vis-a-vis a certain criteria. So first, what I thought he was trying to do is something along the lines of saying, what does it mean to have an organization of political life that's actually effective, rather than simply merely nice words? Or I think what he's looking for is something that goes beyond something that's merely technically pragmatic. What actually has coherent principles upon which to found politics. And he thinks liberalism no longer has that. It is merely, he even has this nice line, just because there's no other option, that's not a compelling argument for liberalism. That just means this is what works for now.
Yeah, I like that point about the way in which it stretches equality as a formal principle to almost like a breaking point, right? Where like the way he says it, the language you used, which I think is correct, was intensity, right? Something with sufficient intensity will replace it. But he's also keen to point out that like that intensity is going to be derived from the way in which that non-formally equal thing has an inequality or unequal division built into it, right? And like the examples that he gives are like, like Owen said, like weird to see him like almost saying very Marxy sounding things like economic inequality is going to start doing the work behind the scenes of this formal liberal equality because of the power and potency, the intensity built into the inequality that it produces. So that like sort of nice facade, but what does it get you? And the answer is certainly not the supposed equality that you thought you were after in the first place. That seems right.
No, yeah, he's keen to point out the kind of hypocrisy in the supposedly universalist conception of equality that liberals are operating with. And so you say, like, show me one liberal democracy or one manifestation of liberalism that isn't predicated on, hypocritically predicated on the exclusion of certain groups of people, on the oppression of certain groups, on radical forms of inequality based on economics or race even, right? He gives the example of the US. I mean, so it's interesting that he does think that democracy is defined by a principle of equality, right? So he's consistent with elements of the Enlightenment tradition that way, except he thinks that we need to basically come to terms with the fact that that equality is always indexed to unequals. Liberalism claims that it doesn't create unequals with its inequality, but like just ask like folks in prison or undocumented people or whatever, right? Like to give more contemporary examples, like there's always disenfranchisement, exclusion and inequality that comes along with, that de facto comes along with a de jure principle of universal equality. And so he's like, look, if we're going to be Democrats, like in lowercase sense of Democrats, let's own up to
I don't
the
think
fact that
Schmitt's a fan of the Democratic Party.
no. In fact, sometimes it seems like the whole book is like written against like 2022 Democrats in a certain way. But yeah, so he said, let's just own the fact that there is no equality without the designation of a group of unequals, the circumscription of a domain of equals, which is inherently exclusive. And just like basically accept that fact, and so, yeah, you can have all things that to us, and quite rightfully so, I think, look barbaric, but for him, he claims that there's nothing inconsistent with, again, democratic politics in those elements of barbarism.
He's not a moralist. So it seems to me, he's like, you might not like what this looks like, but all I'm trying to say, if I'm Carl Schmitt, don't cut that one out. If I'm Carl Schmitt, is that for political concepts to be effective, they must be bounded. And I read Nomos of the Earth, so this is jumping ahead a little bit, but I do still see some continuity. He thinks you can just apply concepts irrespective of any borders, irrespective of any spatial limitation. What you're going to have is a fundamentally inoperable concept. And so he's trying to say all of these pay-ins to universality, to universal brotherhood. Of course, he calls out the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man here. You think you can just cross those borders, but when it comes down to actually affecting these concepts in reality, you're going to actually have to demarcate the space in which they operate. And so here's something I want to put out to you all, because it can sound like I'm so rosy on Carl Schmitt. I'm not one of those Left Schmittians, but it seems to me, what is the point of reading sort of reactionary figures? Well, it seems to me it's never that reactionary figures have everything wrong. It is they often offer the test of those of us who are on the left of what we would have to overcome, if we want to have something that is practical. And so he's laying down this test, this argument that, if you think universality can be unbounded, how do you make it effective? How do you institutionalize it? How do you prevent it from becoming incoherent and collapsing in on itself? And that is something that I think is worthwhile battling Schmitt on. If he's right that concepts need this boundedness, this limitedness, this notion of if you're going to have equality, it has to be a bounded equality that indexes inequality.
So I have a kind of basic question, because this is the first time I've read this. One thing I think he's right about, and then a question. So there is this, what I kind of took away from the first couple chapters of what we read was that there's a I thought the disaggregation was between democracy and justice. Contemporary liberalism assumes those are the same thing. And even if it's not, this was 1923, but I just think everyone since from the Cold War onward, in positioning itself against communism, has argued that democracy and justice are interchangeable, or at least interchangeable enough such that we can assume that democracies are just. And I think it's worth poking at that set of assumptions. When you start to identify injustices in the world, and then you ask yourself, is democracy going to solve this problem? If you just expand democracy into the economy, is that going to do what you want it to do? And the answer, in my opinion, is no. Just giving people more voice. Participation is not just the answer to the question all the time. And I think it's worth entertaining this seriously. What I don't understand, and what didn't become clear to me, is that this whole text is a battle against, in quotes, the Jacobin logic. And I don't really understand what he thinks the Jacobin logic is. So at first, I thought that it was just one more conservative argument against majoritarian domination. There's many conservative arguments against democracy, the tyranny of the majority. But then he seems to say it's not that. He has this little move where he's it's not the tyranny of the majority. It's that the Jacobin logic always turns into the tyranny of a minority. And I think just kind of a first pass at the text. And I'm wondering what you all think the Jacobin logic is? Like, what is the problem he's picking out?
I think it's that the true and the just are what confer legitimacy, and not necessarily like majorities or even necessarily minorities. So minorities, just as well as majorities, can be in possession of the true and the just. Like, it seems he distinguishes between two different ways of understanding what makes legitimacy. He references Hobbes at one point and says that there's a distinction between thinking that legitimacy comes from like truth and justice, or thinking that legitimacy just comes from authority. Right? He likes Hobbes because Hobbes said that what makes legitimacy is authority. It isn't truth and justice, and these concepts are not what authority derives from, what legitimacy derives from. They derive ultimately from authority. And so I think he takes Hobbes' side against the liberal version of trying to claim that you have truth and justice on your side, the Jacobin claim to try to claim that you have to get legitimacy through truth and justice. Like, for him, it is the actual authority. It's the power itself that makes the legitimacy. So does that make sense? Like slotting into those? Yeah.
And I was going to say, while reading this, because I'm also finding myself increasingly reading more conservative thinkers. So y'all know I've already been Hayek pilled. I'm getting Oak Shock pilled right now. And then reading this,
Will. Jesus.
Yeah,
Christ.
no, y'all are about to lose me.
We gotta save our voice.
This is about to be a very different pod. Let me tell you what. But while reading this, I started picking up on Schmitt is also part of this conservative critique. This is also trying to answer Lillian's question of rationalism. So, he also often describes, what you're calling the Jacobin logic, and, what he thinks that he's slandering Marxists by saying they're all rationalists at the end. Insofar as, they think that there's this ultimate harmony to things, and this ultimate harmony is, as Owen was saying, truth and justice, and it will work itself out, even if it's not, like a mechanical law. He tries to be nice and sophisticated with Hegel. It's not like a law of nature, but he sees in this Jacobin, logic, this idea that it is possible for us to plan reality in accordance with these notions of truth and justice. That it is possible for us to be conscious enough and to control human affairs enough that we can, as if it were a machine, create a society that is homologous to truth and justice. He thinks that that's not politics. Is my understanding of what's going on.
And that's his critique of, like you said, of Marxist, what he calls Marxist socialism as well, right? Scientific socialism. The fact that it tries to tie the political project and tie politics to truth, to reason, and to a kind of transcendental conception of justice.
So like, okay. At some point he says that like parliamentarism, which we haven't even talked about really at all, but I think kind of like this is the place to introduce this concept, right? Is this thing, this really peculiar assumption or set of assumptions that comes from a kind of rationalism here, according to which like, well, how do you get truth? Well, you get it by allowing competing opinions to like hash it out in public. And this is going to have all of these postulates about openness and so on and so forth. And his first and I think most cutting question here is like, why the fuck would you think that that's true? First of all, that's a really weird way to think about what truth is and how it works. You're just going to like get everyone to like talk it out and then we're going to come to the truth somehow. But so that's a weird assumption. That's an idea, though, that he thinks belongs not to democracy, but to liberalism, in which we do have this sort of distinction between equality or equal persons who have an equal title to having an opinion and then can hash it out. So it doesn't belong to democracy, which has this substantive kind of equality amongst the democratically represented because we've excluded people. Right, because it's on the basis of this constitutive exclusion that there's a substantive identity of ruler and ruled. So when he talks about, quote, parliamentary democracy, like that's a chimera, right? That's like an intellectually incoherent mishmash, right? Where like we have on the one hand this idea, and like when he goes to Rousseau here, like for me the wheels start really turning. I'm like, oh my God, this critique of Rousseau is so fucking correct. Where he's like, this looks like liberalism. It calls itself a contract theory. It looks like a thing that people who might disagree would like come together and agree to. But then how does it actually work in Rousseau? Oh, well, you get a general will, which is this thing that proves itself to have always been true about the people. And if you were in the minority, bad news. That's just a confirmation that you misunderstood what the general will. Bye, boy. you're done. And so like the minority disappears, right, as something important and substantive. It's actually gone. Like, so now we have an identity of the general will, even with the minority that disagreed, because their vote confirmed that they should be excluded from representation. Right?
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's pretty cool logic right there.
It's very, and this is, I think this is what he means by the Jacobin logic. I think that's what he means by the Jacobin logic. And he's just like, look, like whatever else is true about democracy, let's not pretend that the parliamentarism that's supposedly involved in like this debate of ideas, like actually conferred the legitimacy of that exclusion moment. That's something else. I think that's something else.
Yeah. And he's keen to show that what actually happens in these supposedly open discussions. Well, first of all, he says, look at any of the parliaments that exist around the world, or you could say today, like, look at your US Congress. Like, does that look like truth seeking to you? Like, does that look like a deliberative process? Does it seem rational?
They're on the hunt for justice.
They're on the hunt for the true.
It's like, right. Like, there's no general will formation happening, there's no collective will formation happening in these representative bodies. What's happening is, first of all, he says, and he's right about this, right, that everything increasingly happens in cabinet and in secret committees. Right, secret like congressional or parliamentary committees where all the important stuff is hashed out in a kind of arcane, mysterious like domain. And then second of all, like what's actually driving the deliberations in those arcane, mysterious like places where they're weighing the interests of capital, weighing the interests of party, etc. What's actually going on in there is the creation of policies that are not meant to not serve the general interest, right? They're meant to serve very particular interests.
So let's slow down because I think that's all right, and so I also want to get clear, and so. What is Schmitt's critique of liberal democracy at the end of the day? And by that, I also want to say, so what is Schmitt's positive vision? So I actually was kind of interested here where I don't think you actually get his full-fledged positive vision. You get the hints, you get the winks, but I think this is more of a negative critique. And I don't want to lean too much.
What are the winks and the hints, like the fash? I
think the dictatorship, the mobilization of the people.
Proletariat, a different
certainly not. Oh my God, certainly not.
That's what I didn't get. Okay, sorry to interrupt you, but when I was reading the section on Marx and like the dictatorship of the proletariat stuff, I was like, so you just want a different one? So like, what's your critique of Marxism? You're just salty that the Soviet Union has a dictatorship and you don't get one anymore.
I think, he's salty about a couple things.
This is an honest question.
He's salty about the internationalism.
Are you actually making a critique, or are you just big mad? Like, I was kind of like...
Well, in order for like dictatorship to work and be democratic in his model, what he requires is that there be what he calls like the homogeneity of the people, right? So there has to be
the Red Army that crushed you.
Big mad.
That came in
that's the episode drop right there.
Get fucking wrecked, Carl. Get wrecked.
The pod gets tanky pilled. So you need that homogeneity. I mean, one of the problems with proletarian so he talks about the friend enemy distinction as being something that you can kind of graft onto class struggle as well. Right, but his issue there is always like the internationalism of it, the idea of like a global proletarian revolution or something, which isn't sufficiently delimited. So you need for him, like, in order to have a properly democratic dictatorship, unity of people and those that rule, you need the homogeneity and delimitation. Right, so the homogeneity is, I mean, there's the wink wink too. I mean, it's like ethnic homogeneity. It seems
he won't come out and say it, but it's just like, so what is the principle of identity? Yeah.
It's behind the curtain.
By the way,
right?
There are maniacs that try to save Schmitt and say, no, it's not. It has nothing to do with ethnic. The homogeneity thing is totally harmless. It's like homogeneity of political culture and all this, whatever. So there are ways that people do try to go that route, but basically
they're wrong.
Very, very sophisticated. Wow.
Very sophisticated. Yeah,
very clever.
They're at Yale and Columbia and shit. But in any case, yeah. So you need that ethnic homogeneity, and it's got to be delimited territorially, delimited culturally and ethnically, and all these delimitations that you were referencing, Will. and then you can do some good politics. I think what's good politics on Schmitt's account.
And I also want to add one more thing to the delimitation of probably why he's in our sophisticated language big mad about the Soviet is also it's not just transgressing national borders, it's also transgressing borders between politics and economy. He does make well, he states it. I don't know if he makes the point, but he states it that principles of equality are different when irrespective of the domain you are talking about. So the domain of politics, what equality means there will be different than the domain of economics or economy, and what will be the principle of equality there. And so he is also deeply suspicious of so we're just going to blend all of these spheres of social life and under one principle of equality. And for him, and we'll get back to my sort of negative question, so is Schmitt's problem with this transgression of borders, is his problem with parliamentary democracy or liberal democracy, either that it's not effective or that it's hypocritical, that it actually turns in on itself? Because I also was a bit confused when he was like, you all talk about liberal parliamentary democracy as if it's really this thing, but it turns out all the important decisions are made behind closed doors. And if you just read this quickly, you might think like, is that Comrade Schmitt? Is that saying like, what about the people? But I don't think that that's what he's saying. So I'm wondering is he saying that it will collapse in on itself, that it will no longer be workable, or is he saying that it's not authentically united with this amorphous notion of the people that he has that we don't really get grips on, because he doesn't tell us what he thinks politics should look like. But that is my question.
Good question.
I share this question because that's kind of what I was asking. Like when I'm saying what was the critique, and you're like throwing out some different options. Like when liberals make this critique of communism and of the dialectic, like like in a way, what he's saying is just like Karl Popper could have wrote this, any Cold War liberal could have wrote this, like we've heard it before. But from their perspective, they're not big mad, they're just like big moralism, they're just like, you are hypocritical and it's not authentically democratic, and all of these contradictions amount to dictatorship, and you think it's going to be the rational democracy, but in fact it's the inverse. Like that does seem to be like, that's not a criticism that's original to him. But then if he's arguing against liberalism at the same time, I just don't get, and I've heard this about Schmitt, like people don't think he has normative criteria, but like I genuinely don't understand the criteria. Like the reason I think he sounds big mad is it's just like you're just jealous that they have a dictatorship and you don't have a dictatorship, and you want one, So, and you want one with the right circumscribed boundaries, and you're mad that like the communists are showing up in Germany, and before they talk to your politicians, they're like pamphleting your soldiers, to like overthrow your government. Like that's what you're mad about. And so, there's just, sorry, I'm being a little like facetious, but great. I just don't quite get the thrust of the argument from a non-liberal. Like in that case, it's just like, okay, so you have opposition and they want to crush you and you want to crush them, and like go big or go home. And sadly, at the end of the day, he loses, which must have made him mad forever. But yeah.
Yeah, good. So I am now realizing, I think, and this is me drawing upon other Schmitt that I've read, so here is his normative point. The normative point is, let's just like, bring it down a notch. Schmitt's a scared little man. And what he's scared of is that he thinks that at the center of reality it's just chaos. And for him, his biggest fear is that, what parliamentary democracy does in its transgression of borders is that it actually opens the way for full-blown chaos, the dissolution of politics, economy, etc. And so for him, what's reactionary in Schmitt is, for him, it isn't as if there's a positive good that he's straining for. All he wants is, to use the Greek word, I think, katakon or something like, the restraining of chaos, the restraining of the dissolution Constitution because there isn't actually inbuilt normativity in the world. There's just, the power to constrain the random dynamism of social life. And so when he's looking at the Soviet Union, rights of man, he's like, you all think you're doing this moral good, but what you're doing is actually opening the way for the loss of stability. And this is, I think, what makes him distinctly, even not giving a sort of liberal critique. He's not saying that the problem is the loss of democracy with, the dictatorship of the proletariat. What he's saying is it's the loss of politics and social life as such. Because I just also want to say this real quick, because remember, for him, democracy is rather formal. You could have a Republican democracy, you could have a liberal democracy, you could have a dictatorship democracy. And so for him, unlike I think liberals, he doesn't actually have substantive content for democracy that would say democracy good. He's saying actually democracy is available for all sorts of things. And so I think this is where he's going. There's a type of realist edge to him, but it's a dark realism, where he thinks only a sort of type of sovereignty and delimitation can hold back this constant churn of chaos that's at the heart of life.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, of the two in this dyad, liberalism and democracy, he does seem to have a marked preference for democracy. It's just that he thinks that, as you said, democracy can take on any number of different political and institutional forms, because again, he's defined it in a pretty thin formal way. It's the identity of ruler and ruled, right, in some form or another. And his beef with the liberals, like, to go back to Lillian's question, which I really like, it's not just a hypocrisy critique. I think that you're right, that he's got a more effectivity or viability based argument, right? He wants to say that, like, the liberal form of trying to establish democracy opens itself up to, like, kind of subversion from within. It almost starts sounding like Derrida to me. He starts talking about, like, this sort of, like, to just, like, use Derridian language for a second, this kind of, like, auto deconstruction of the democratic, right? So he's like, oh, if what you think is the thing that secures democracy are these democratic, quote unquote, democratic institutions, oh, you've got a parliament? Great, cool. What if the representatives get together and vote a fucking, like, anti-democratic dictator into power? Like, what happens to the stability this was meant to secure, right? And so, like, there's the legitimacy problem because of the hypocrisy at the core of it. But also he thinks that, like, these liberal parliamentarian institutions aren't sufficiently stable or are incapable of protecting the supposedly democratic core. Whereas, by contrast, I think if he's got a norm here, he's like, yeah, you know what? Dictatorial democracy, like, that's powerful. That shit can take care of the interlopers and the dissenters.
Yeah, he has this, like, really great moment. He's even, this following up on what you're saying. Like, yeah, there's a moment where I'm like, oh, I get why Derrida has a whole chapter on Schmitt. Because, it's almost like, Schmitt plagiarized Derrida in the future. Where he has someone like, if you really are doing the democratic principle, then, the people could just choose to not have democracy anymore. And you'd have to be okay with that. And he uses this example.
And you have to be authoritarian in that sense. You said you have two options. Either democracy goes away or it goes away anyways. Like, either democracy goes away because the authoritarian people win, or it goes away because you have to suspend, like, liberal democratic rule and do some authoritarian shit to suppress this authoritarian party, right? He says this is like, I think it's the irreducibility.
Sounds familiar to me.
Yeah, exactly.
We've never seen that before.
No, I think what Will and Gil, you guys are saying, is, like, absolutely right, though, because I think that he thinks that what liberalism tries to do is to, like, liquidate politics, to turn the friend-enemy relationship into the debating adversary, into the economic competitor, both domestically and, like, internationally. And he thinks that politics is an ineluctable part of human reality. It's the friend-enemy distinction goes along with, like, the beautiful and the ugly, which is essential to aesthetics, that goes along with, like, truth and falsity, which is essential to epistemology, right? And all of that. It's a distinction that lies at the core of who we are. And so his issue with liberal democracy is that it tries to liquidate something that ain't going anywhere. Like, and that's why he says, like, you make this, like, you attempt to eliminate it. And what happens is that these relationships of enmity reappear domestically in all kinds of ways, right? Whether it be people that are excluded within, to use Sina Kramer's expression, which I really like, or it's like, you have like massive economic inequality. There are all these ways in which politics will keep insisting on itself. So we might as well, we're way better served, I think, in the long term for Schmitt, in just understanding that this is the logic of politics, the relationship of friend and enemy, the fact that politics is totally unmoored from principles of truth and justice that are like universal and ahistorical. And so like, so that's I think is the...
I have two things to say there. That's really great. One, just to do a callback. It's almost as if Schmitt is writing this, and Thrasymachus once more is just like, y'all rang? Oh, I thought y'all got a lead for me, but
100%.
Oh yeah. And the other thing I would say is like, Schmitt red eye, gif when Nancy Pelosi a couple days ago was just like, we need a strong Republican Party. We want a strong Republican Party. This is someone who misunderstands fundamentally for all of our critiques of the Democratic Party. Here's the Schmittian critique of that moment. You don't understand politics. That's an abdication of politics. And also it will lead to the worst because you don't even understand the game that you're playing. You think the game that you're playing is friendly debate. But, the use language that Owen was saying for Schmitt, in his understanding, the politics is irreducible. Its intensity is this friend-enemy distinction. And his beef with liberals is and his beef also with Jacobin logic and all of that is, you all keep dreaming of this time where politics will finally be suspended, where the friend-enemy distinction is merely a historical artifact, and it will finally be displaced, and what you will have is some sort of pre-established harmony where everyone throws out their opinions and somehow something good comes of it. And so, again, I know it sounds like I'm rosy on Schmitt, but I think sometimes when you're reading him, you can see why he can be gripping to those on the right and the left, where he's saying, if you're going to do politics, you're going to do politics. Stop dreaming of beyond politics and understand that this is, a modality of human life on which there's this intensity to stake claims, to make borders. This is not, a Monopoly game, or I don't know why I said Monopoly. This isn't Uno.
So my
this is life and death.
But my personal...
exactly. Uno rocks, so that's why I went with that.
We out here playing Risk. We playing Trouble.
Schmitt loves that. Yeah. We playing Risk.
My issue is there is a part of me that wants to preserve the insistence on the conflictuality of politics, which I think sometimes it's easier to avoid than it is to, look straight at. But to have that conflict not be grounded in the irrationalism of intense association with a certain group of people because of, I don't know, ethnicity or is it possible? And this has been a question I've tried to counter Terry with that I don't think I've ever adequately answered. But is it possible to preserve an element of that emphasis on the fact that, politics very often, maybe always does involve a friend-enemy distinction of some kind, but that friend-enemy distinction isn't made in left politics on the basis of totally irrational criteria, but it's actually made on the basis of a clash between injustice and a conception of a just world.
Okay, great. So there is a moment where I think this can also help me clarify, maybe or help answer to another question Lillian asked before, which is what is his problem with Marxism and with communism? Because he says at some point that all of these representative liberal democracies think that the substance of politics is a conflict of opinions and not a struggle of interests, right? Yeah. And he thinks that once this more realpolitik, honest truth about the thing is that no, it's a struggle of interests. That's an irreconcilability. This is the theory of partisanship. And part of his beef with the Marxists and the communists that he's looking at the time, I think, might have something to do with on the one hand, they recognize that. Right? Class struggle is the motor of history. And this is, in fact, an irreconcilable antagonism between proletarian and bourgeois. Mm-hmm. But then you also get these other claims that do sound like they're from this Enlightenment rationalist tradition about how oh, and by the way, the proletariat is the universal class. Oh, and by the way, it represents the interests of humanity as a whole, of everyone. and like this will lead to the abolition of class. And he's like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, first of all, that makes it sound a lot nicer to the bourgeois who are about to reappropriate from, right? It's like as though exactly, bust out the guillotines and tell me again how this is about the universal mission of humanity, right? And then again, like the sort let's call it naive utopian aspiration to put an end to class antagonism. He's like, that's just not a thing, y'all. Like, where is this coming from? So this might be like one way of trying to get at like his beef with like the communist project, at least as he understands it in his day.
The antagonism's never going away. I mean, it'll shift to a different domain. He would say, like, even if you resolve a certain kind of antagonism in the economic sphere, it will be displaced onto another sphere of human, like, social life. And so, that element of it,
Yeah, look, when I read Schmitt, and maybe this is a broader question, but I still think it's with the text that we read. There's something really bracing reading Schmitt. And by bracing, I mean like, fuck. What is the end of politics? And it seems like in Schmitt's view, there is no preordained end. There is no necessary end. And in fact, politics is a force in and of itself. That it is, it's integral to the types of human creatures that we are. And the best we can do is to contain it as well as we can. But to dream of doing without it is disastrous. And so here's the broader question that I'm asking. So, I think sometimes on the left, those of us who, whether we're scientific Marxists or utopian Marxists, or something like that, a lot of us, I don't think that what we want to buy into is that, politics is just simply this endless affair of, to use Owen's language, intense affiliations. That there is something that we want to bring into existence. There is a better arrangement of affairs. But then you read Schmitt, and if he is right, then we're the dupes. And and we won't even be able to do the thing that we are claiming. And so I'm wondering, is it worth, if we are on the left, to think, so what is the substance of, I think for Schmitt he'd say the political, honestly. What is the substance of it? Is it to overcome it, or is it to mobilize it, instrumentalize it towards the ideals that we have, whether that is truth or justice? I think we're at a certain point, we know Schmitt's not going to agree with us, but I think at least he's laying this landscape or this terrain that we have to reckon with if we don't want to fall into his traps. And I think for someone like the Nancy Pelosi example I used, I think Schmitt's got the number there. He's like, you don't even know what you're doing, and you're going to undo the very good that you think you're bringing about. But I don't want to descend into an idea of it is just conflict all the way down. Irreducible, intense. And I keep saying this language of intense because intensity is really important.
That's his language too.
Because he thinks that's what activates us. Yeah. That's what mobilizes us. And he thinks if politics is anything, it's an activation, it's a mobilization. But I think for some of us, that's kind of frightening, the idea of always being mobilized and activated. And maybe I'm just speaking for myself.
So I feel like to have that kind of perspective, you have to live in the era of mass politics. I can't think of any population that's less mobilized and activated than our own currently. We're activated in our mind. But that's not activation. We're stimulated.
I'm pretty active on Twitter.
Yeah, he's looking around at Weimar. She's looking around at Weimar Germany and saying, "Damn, people are pretty damn politically active." It's extremely different historical context.
Very different. So I guess what I don't get about the friend-enemy distinction thing is what kinds of friends and enemies are you talking about? There's contest. Okay, so you have different sides to some kind of contest. There's different normative problems or harms or kinds of injustice that are located, depending on the question that you're asking and the nature of the conflict. So it's just it's okay, so you eradicate the deep class antagonism. Just because there's more conflicts doesn't mean that it's just a perpetuation of the same. The conflicts can be different kinds of conflicts. Getting rid of deep class antagonisms doesn't mean getting rid of politics. That's why the kind of gloss on that, the concrete nature of the socialist project and the series of equivocations you have to make to be yeah, politics is people engaging in conflict. And when they do that, they oppose one another, and they call one the friend and they call the other the enemy. You position yourself against other people. That makes it seem like the positioning is like somehow arbitrary, and then, yeah, like once it's over, it'll just be put onto something else. But like, why? And like, what if that's fine because the thing that is something else is just like more just than the thing that came before? Like, it's okay to have conflict that doesn't entail domination. It just means...
I see what you're saying. I think that, like, in order to respond to that, though, it should be clear that, like, his view of conflict has to do with, like, existential conflict. The sense that your way of life is being threatened from outside or from like enemies within. He's always using this expression of like ways of life, like forms of life that are being threatened. And I think he thinks that for as long as human beings can, like, in order to create a coherent collective form of life, there has to be that relationship of enmity, something that you're willing to like sacrifice and die for, right? The sacrificial element of that conflict is really important too. And so, like, yeah, so I get that doesn't really answer your question about like why it is that we can't just kind of like say, okay, we're going to address class antagonism and there will be like other kinds of conflict. But I think that the point he wants to make to like Marxists, who he thinks are, well, both scientific and utopian like socialists, is to say that element of like existential conflict, that element of sense of like existential fear of the other eliminating you or eliminating your way of life. And we see that language all the time, like they hate our way of life, or our way of life is, that's just how we go about making political community. And so it will just, if we're not doing it in one sector, we'll do it in another sphere of human activity. But it's just going to shift around because that is what, and there's an anthropological, a kind of pseudo-anthropological point that is underlying all of this, right? About the nature of human beings. And I think it's a kind of Hobbesian philosophical anthropology.
Well, I mean, like maybe one takeaway then is something like, if we think that Schmitt is even a little bit right in this pretty spurious philosophical anthropology, like even a little bit, then like the form of trying to motivate struggle for like a leftist project that actually does seek the abolition of class antagonism can't use that as the motivator. It can't be like, hey, get on board with our project to, try to transform their mode of production, because it'll get rid of antagonism and conflict. Like that's not honest or accurate. It might not.
You need to make enemies of the imperialists or like class enemies or what, you know what I mean? Like you can't construct a coherent collective force, I guess, for him. Like I'm just trying to think through this. Like this is not something that I agree with, right? But
no, I mean,
you can't construct a coherent.
We're doing the
force.
descriptive, not the normative, right now.
Yeah.
Because I think it's worth Now I just wanted to jump in and say this because Lillian mentioned the friend-enemy distinction. Then I remembered something else. I think I know about Schmitt. Also, what's important for the friend-enemy distinction is it's an existential choice. It isn't as if there are natural friends and enemies. You know that you have chosen the friend-enemy distinction correctly insofar as people are activated and motivated to prosecute that case. And so, for him, again, there's like this abyss at the heart of social life. And so the friend-enemy distinction is it's retroactively proven insofar as, there's a requisite intensity of political collectives. And so the way that I'm thinking about what's going on with Schmitt is, there's a really dark picture of humanity that Schmitt has, that he thinks that we can only really feel alive, understand ourselves, and have some sort of stability of social life insofar as we are activated by this distinction that only politics can give us. And to destroy that distinction, to try to move beyond it, I almost like not to move too quickly, see almost a type of Nietzscheanism in them, where it's just like, what we would just be a mass of human creatures, passive, formless. There'd be nothing remarkable about us. Of course, added into this, he thinks it would be catastrophic. And so it seems to me that what he's saying is that politics requires choosing well to activate people into an intensity of social action. And if you think that politics is simply about mere conflict or disagreement, you're missing that actually what's important is, are people willing to give their lives for it? And, I don't know if there are Schmitt fans out there, but I think that that's actually just really important. He thinks, are you willing to die for this? That is, that says that politics is not simply a game of Uno, as I said. This is, your existential being. And if it's not that, if you try to turn politics into, we can disagree and live with one another, he's like, see what you get.
Yeah, there is a kind
and I mean that almost like he's like saying it as a threat.
It sounds like a fucking threat.
And again, I'm not saying I agree with Schmitt on this point. I'm just trying to lay out what I think his argument is. I always think with these reactionary figures, it's important to just keep saying, I'm not saying I agree. I'm just saying that this is what I think he is seeing in the world.
But the answer to my question is an anthropological claim. That's so it's not that he's giving, there's no better argument for it other than this is just what people are like.
The inescapability of conflict postulate.
In that particular
I think so.
kind. And
I think
when I'm saying, what if it's okay, there's conflicts and then there's conflicts, his answer is that this particular kind of conflict is necessary for anthropological reasons.
Or so I think there's two parts of it too. I think it's necessary for anthropological reasons, but clearly he thinks that one of his critiques of the kind of bourgeois liberal order is that maybe it can kind of pragmatically go on for a decent amount of time. And it's not that it even though it's kind of going against this thing that we're claiming has an anthropological foundation, right? The friend-enemy distinction, politics, it tries to liquidate politics, which he seems to be rooting in a kind of pseudo-anthropological claim about us. It goes on, even though it's contravening those anthropological imperatives in a certain way, but it's just lost, disaggregated. There's almost a spiritual element to it, of just sitting around and fucking watching TikToks and vaping. You know what I mean? And you're just working in a kind of siloed way.
Big L for Gen Z.
Yeah, exactly, right? That's not, and there's just a kind of spiritual lassitude and a kind of emptiness at the heart of existence that he thinks comes with that. And that is why it's not just a descriptive claim about the irreducibility of politics, but there is a kind of normative claim about a fulfilled human life in a certain way, which a fulfilled collective human existence.
So is it right that this is a fasci interpretation of Nietzsche? So Nietzsche's you see the abyss, you can be one of the burnt children and you can make value, the art of living. And this is I think for Nietzsche pretty individualistic. He has a lot of disdain for collective enterprise.
Oh yeah.
And then Schmitt's interpretation of this is no, the way of making meaning is this existential conflict between
which is a collective enterprise.
Which is a collective enterprise.
Right.
Yeah.
But which does still require these moments of distinction, right, of drawing the difference between we ourselves and those others, and in and through doing so, stabilizing a social order and producing something like a meaning. And he thinks that that's an inescapable thing. I mean, I also wonder whether there's some moments where Schmitt seems like a pretty good historian, and I wonder whether there isn't some, because I don't know if I buy this anthropological thesis at all either, like you, Lily, and I'm pretty skeptical, but I don't know, sometimes I wonder whether or not there isn't a historical case for this, right? Show me the antagonistic way of rendering groups or people apart from one another that we've overcome. Show me any one that we've ever done. Has that ever actually happened? And then if like the pitch is like, no, but maybe we could. It's like, all right, well, I mean, sure, fine.
Yeah, that's where his like realism or whatever would like come in and be like, well,
it actually is wild. Read Nomos of the Earth. For a Nazi, and maybe actually it's not wild, but it was wild in grad school when I read this. For a Nazi, he is startling aware of colonialism. He's like, yeah, that was really violent, and yet also. Yeah. That is what helped make the world. And there is the way of reading him critiquing colonialism as, an overextension of one's borders. But he also thinks that's what it took to activate people. And so, he is a historian. He is, I can't believe I'm saying it this way. He is well read. But, how he's interpreting the materials of history, I think, is definitely open to question. I think it's also important to say that, it is a sort of terrifying picture of politics and, like what Lillian said, this fasci interpretation of Nietzsche that he's giving, where, he thinks that this is the only way to give form to us as human creatures. But I think the last thing I will say is useful in reading Nietzsche is that if you are someone
Nietzsche
who takes
Schmitt?
Schmitt. Yeah. Yeah. Blah, Schmitt. But I'm pretty sure the other guy might be a bit reactionary too, but we like him more though.
Shout outs Lacerda.
Those who make, big shout out. Those who make easy gestures to universalism, to universal justice as principles that can activate solid, coherent, and effective political constituencies. I think you have to have an argument against Schmitt. And, to ignore him or to say that there's nothing there, I think you might fall into, his trap of saying, so you think that this easy hand waving to universality can create a political community? Look at, political history. When has that been the case? And so I think it's important to reckon with him, never to agree with him, and certainly never to become a Schmittian. I don't think that's the way to go. But I think it's a task.
The whole history of the left also too is a history of different antagonisms. Like imagine trying to do the history of any powerful, whether it be like anti-colonial, whether it be like workers movement, like imagine any single one example of those like political struggles that took place without that element of antagonism and even the sacrificial logic of being willing to die in those antagonisms oftentimes. Right?
So I want to ask now that we've discussed this and I'm willing to now indulge it, what does it mean to be like a left Schmittian? Like I hear this phrase a lot and I ignore it because it seems like it's not.
And that's a good policy probably.
There are some things that I just indulge, but I will now. Like what is it?
I don't know. Isn't Chantal Mouffe
like,
one of the main exponents
why is the left attracted?
For her, like Chantal Mouffe has
the
agonistic thing, right?
That
like she uses Schmitt to like make an argument against like Habermas and Rawls and the notion of like solving problems deliberatively, right? That she's trying to basically nod to the irreducibility of conflict and say like, no, what politics needs to do is to like construct a space in which those agonisms are actually playing. There's an agonistic struggle that is able to be played out, but it's kind of bounded in a certain way, and it doesn't get to the level of maybe wanting to kill or actually being constituted politically in such a way as you're ready to kill.
It's the version of it. It's
it's
existential conflict.
It's like soy Schmitt. It's like soy Schmitt.
Soy Schmitt.
It is though.
It is,
oh my God.
But that's so true, Owen. But like,
dude, it's so
have
funny.
those two words ever been put together in the history of humanity?
No, it's like that. It's like that Zizek shit, right? About how like it's Schmitt, but diet Schmitt. You get the Schmitt, but without the caffeine.
Without the caffeine.
Without the life or death struggle. Yeah.
It's like actually that was central. I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm not sure that's Schmitt anymore. But Owen said what I was going to say about what left Schmittianism is supposed to be. It's this idea of we need to return to an activation of friend and enemy. We need to move away from pines to deliberation to brotherhood. All of that misses what politics is supposed to be, which is this intense affair of social practice.
By the way, can I just say, totally in agreeing with this, that like I couldn't stop thinking when I was reading that critique of Rousseau of Rawls and the way that he constructs the thought experiment, the original position, because what Schmitt says about Rousseau is like, he's calling himself a contract theorist. We all talk about the social contract as this liberal thing. Actually, it's just democratic and not individualistic or liberal at all. And I was reading this being like, oh shit, that is exactly true of Rawls as well, right? Like the whole point of like, and again, coming out of this like weird set of assumptions around like rationalism, ode to an Enlightenment conception of human beings. Again, another totally spurious philosophical anthropology, mind you, right? In which it's
I'm
just
warmer
like,
to rationalism, though.
if I construct this decision situation just so, then everyone will agree. Everyone will agree that this is justice, and even if
just
you
need a
were,
little
you know,
more conceptual engineering.
it's
That's
like
all.
that's what what are you talking about? Like, this isn't like a contract theory where people actually have differing interests. This is a means of constructing a rationalist ideal hypothesis so as to produce an ineliminable identity. And it's like, that's not liberal, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rawls. That's anti-liberal.
Yeah.
Oh, my boy
Which we hate to
Rawls.
see.
Yeah, we hate to see it.
Hate to see it. Well, I think that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks where you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Murray, Tasia Mars, Michael Salter, MLA Chernoff, Av, Mohammed Rawas, Isaac Stewart, Spencer, Chris Hall, Andre Hoop, Peter Karenye, Alec Perkins, James Screda, D. Mbare, G, NR962, respect, G, a different one, second G, Seth Dalton, Zlatan Ramuzovic, and Kirko. Thank you very much. If you too would like to support what we're doing, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos. Follow us on Twitter at leftofphil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. Super important. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.